Perception is our subjective experience of the world, and the interesting thing about it is that this subjective experience very few times matches the objective reality that is out there. So we talked about illusions, about subjective perceptions that don't match reality, and we're all familiar with some spectacular illusions out there that you can see on the web. But these are the cases where the discrepancy between reality and perception is highest, what we normally call illusions. But the fact is that most of our perception is, at least to some extent, illusory, because very, very rarely we have 100% correspondence between reality and perception. We don't have illusions just on the visual domain. Illusions affect to all sensory modalities, and they affect to cognitive modalities as well. So what we hear, what we touch, what we think, what we remember, most of the cases, this is at least to some extent illusory. What we experience, our experience of the world, is not the reality. This doesn't mean that there is not a reality. There is a reality out there, but this is not what we experience. What we experience is a brain simulation of this reality. It's a construct, sort of like in the movie The Matrix. The people live in this illusory world that is a computer simulation, and we all live in this illusory matrix as well that our brain creates for us. And this is the only thing that we interact with, this simulation, not the real world. Now, why do we need to simulate the world instead of experiencing the world directly? Well, one very good reason, one very important reason, is that we don't have the neural machinery necessary to experience the world as it is. We cannot sample every little portion of the world, every little pixel in the scene, so to speak. To do that, our brain would have to be the size of a building, and it wouldn't fit in our head. The size of a building wouldn't be enough to experience reality as it is. So we don't have the same density of photoreceptors all in the retina, if we just think about it from a vision perspective. If we extend our arm and look at our thumbnail, that's the only area in the whole visual field where we're not legally blind. It's the only place in the scene where we can see with high detail. And this is just from a purely visual perspective. But when you bring attention into the equation as well, then what we end up perceiving and experiencing is that we attend to, and we only attend to a very small portion of the world as well. And not only that, but everything that we're not directly attending to, the brain is actively suppressing. So when we attend to something, that doesn't mean that we're enhancing that part of the scene. It means that we're actively suppressing everything else. So we have a combination of both sensory and cognitive factors that make our perception a very tiny fraction of what's actually out there. So the brain is going to be filling in gaps and coming up with guesstimates and taking shortcuts to overcome all of these limitations and try to arrive at a picture that is not necessarily exactly what's out there, but that is close enough to let us navigate the world and survive and reproduce and so on. So in coming up with these shortcuts to deal with these limitations, a lot of the times we get it right or close to right, but a significant fraction of the time we get it very wrong. And these are the spectacular illusions that I was mentioning earlier, but we have far less spectacular illusions that are nevertheless mismatches between perception and experience, and we have this all the time, every hour, multiple times an hour, on a daily basis, and we're so used to dealing with them that most of the time we ignore them. Perception, not all perception is based on memory. Memory can influence perception, especially in the more cognitive or higher level information processing domains. If we have a model of the world that is based on our experience, that model is going to modulate our perception. In a lot of the cases, we're going to try to fit our perception to that model, to our preconception. But not all illusions are going to be influenced by memory per se, or even by our experience of the world in general. There are illusions that are very basic, that are very sensory and hardwired into our brain, and that's going to be irrespective to our pre-assumptions or preconceptions. A white circle on a black background, or say a gray circle on a white background, is going to look darker than the same gray circle on a black background. And this just has to do with the brain is comparing visual information with what's surrounding it to come up with whether something should be black or white. We're doing this, our visual neurons from the retina on are organized in these sort of like antagonistic comparative processes. So even if you try to overcome these basic brightness type illusions, it's going to be basically impossible, because that's the way that your brain is hardwired, and it's hardwired that way from the very beginning, and regardless of your experience of the world. What you're describing is something that is fairly cognitive, and it has to do with the aesthetics and that our appreciation of one type of art versus another, and that is going to depend on fashion and cultural expectations and experience and so on. But what I'm referring to here is the very basic visual processes, even in those cases in which people were horrified at music that didn't even sound like music to them, it sounded completely dissonant. They were still recognizing that this is intended to be music. Even if I dislike it, this is music, this is a sensory stimulus. They may be able to repeat the tone if they had, if they were not completely tone deaf. They were not because they hadn't experienced that type of music before. It's not that they were confused and that I'm mistaking that situation for visual stimulation or olfactory stimulation, or that they were thinking, okay, these are not instruments, this is instead bird singing or a train approaching. So we're still, ultimately, there are two components here. We have a brain that is to a large extent hardwired to build our perception, but the same brain is also to a large extent modulated by experience, and this experience is going to have an effect on the neural connections that are established. But just because you have a modulatory effect of experience and of preconceptions and pre-assumptions, that doesn't mean that the whole of our perception is explained at that level. You have different levels of processing. And again, the closer that you are to the sensory input, the more resilient you're going to be to the effect of experience. So we have what we call sensory illusions and cognitive illusions. As the name indicates, sensory illusions are going to be closest, are going to be taking place in the brain at the closest levels to the sensory input. And these are going to be very difficult to manipulate, even by having the knowledge that this is an illusion that doesn't match the real world. We're still going to perceive it even if we don't want to. Whereas as we advance in the information processing hierarchy and we get to what we call cognitive illusions, and these are illusions that are affected by cognitive processes such as attention or memory or cause-effect relationships or decision-making, these illusions are going to be much more susceptible to our experience of the world and our expectations and so on. And they're also going to be more susceptible to us being able to overcome them just by our knowledge that this is an illusion that is not so. A lot of people have come up with this legend that when the European ships first arrived to America and the people who were living there saw this, well, actually the legend is that they didn't see these things, huge things approaching because they had never seen anything like it, so their brain couldn't handle it, and therefore they were taken completely by surprise. This is completely apocryphal, of course. It's a nice story, but it's not the truth. These people, even if they had never seen a ship before, they had seen trees or mountains, and they had seen all other sorts of things. So they might not have realized that these are ships. They could have decided they're animals or what have you, but the visual input would have been there, and that they would have stimulated their visual systems, even if they couldn't assign it exactly to the proper object category. And yeah, by the same token, you could say that if ever we have a visit from extraterrestrials, we wouldn't be able to see them at all because we would have never experienced them. But of course, this is nonsensical. And a more everyday example: if this were so, we would never be able to see anything in our lives, because when a child is first born, it has no visual experience of the world, and then by that reasoning, the first time that he sees or she sees their mother face, they wouldn't be able to see it because they've never seen it before, and then they wouldn't build an experience, and then we would end up seeing nothing and experiencing nothing because at first we have no experience to begin with. The perceptual abilities of infants, in fact, are quite remarkable. There's an experiment that every new parent can do, and this involves visual neurons and mirror neurons in particular. If you take an infant that is just 1 day or even a few hours old, and you stick your tongue at it, that baby will stick their tongue back at you. So now think about what this entails. Somehow this baby, who a few hours ago had seen nothing whatsoever, maybe just some changes in lightness at best, is able somehow to watch this face, to at some level recognize that this is a tongue, to put that together with his or her own model of their head and their mouth, and come up with a motor action of sticking their tongue back at you. So this is remarkable that we can do this, and this already tells you that a lot of what we do that feels even voluntary or thought through is reflexive and hardwired. I don't know that the main function of the brain is to guess. In fact, I have a little trouble about establishing or stating that the brain or any other organ has the function of anything. That's a teleological argument. It's not that we have a brain so we can think, or that we have eyes so we can see. Things evolve in evolution by random mutations that get selected or selected against, and that in a way that benefits ultimately our survival, or at least that it doesn't pose disadvantage to our survival. So I wouldn't phrase it that way, that the function of the brain is to guess, but I would say that because of the limitations that our brain has, we are forced, at a fundamentally neural level, we are forced to make guesses constantly, all the time. You would have to define what you mean by our brain perceives something, but we're only aware of a subset of that. For most people in neuroscience, I'd say that perception and awareness are basically the same thing. So if you're perceiving something, you're aware of something. So you could say, the way that I would phrase that is that at any given time, you have a whole lot of sensory information arriving to your senses, your vision, and all of your other sensory systems, but ultimately you only consciously experience a tiny fraction of them, or perceive them, or are aware of. The world is objective, and so there is a reality, there is an objective reality, and science attempts to figure out that objective reality. Now, of course, the scientist is limited because the scientist is subjective to neural limitations and neural deceptions, but the scientific method, for the most part, provides us fairly powerful tools that we can use to try and overcome some of these limitations, just like you can use glasses to, if your vision is deficient, to overcome some of your problems. So you can use a hearing aid if you have a hearing problem. The scientific method is an aid to deal with this inherent subjectivity and susceptibility to illusions that we all have. But of course, the scientific method is not perfect, and that's why we don't talk about verifying a hypothesis. We know that there is a truth out there, but the scientific method doesn't work to establish the truth. What the scientific method is good at is at discarding what's wrong. And by following an elimination process, the hope is that we will eventually arrive to the truth, or to as close a picture of the truth as our neural systems will allow us. But again, that's why we don't talk about verifying a hypothesis, but we talk about validating a hypothesis, which means this hypothesis looks correct for now. It can be very difficult to distinguish between processes that are hardwired, and especially processes that are innate to our system, from those processes that become, due to experience, and become basically solidified and ingrained into our brains and into the way that we operate as conscious beings. Indeed, speaking of consciousness, a lot of what we now know about how we operate is that most of our actions are not conscious. In fact, we are conscious only a very small fraction of the time, as we walk around the street and we go have lunch and we even talk to people and just go about our day. A lot of these actions are what we call zombie behaviors. At one point they were conscious, sort of like when you first learn to play tennis, say, and you're very aware about how you're holding the racket, and you're aware of the position of your wrist and the position of your arm, and that you are experiencing the motion of your body and the specific parts of your body. But as you become proficient, a lot of this becomes automatic. And then you don't need to think about it anymore, and you release your consciousness to then think about the strategy overall of the game, which you wouldn't even be thinking about as a beginner. So all of these behaviors that become automatized and become a fundamental part of who you are, as a person and neurally, it can be hard to distinguish whether this is something that was acquired and become automatized, or if it was there, being completely hardwired from the beginning. So that is the challenge, and that's why it is important. Some of the developmental studies in neuroscience that are being carried out are very important to determine exactly what abilities we are born with and which abilities are we acquiring throughout our life experience and how this happens. The initial ability, some objects, just because of the way that our neurons operate, the fundamental characteristics of neuronal processing is that an object that is in motion or an object that changes is going to be more salient to our visual system than an object that doesn't. This is neural adaptation, and this is intrinsic to the way that all nervous systems operate, not just our own. But you can think again in terms of the limitation of resources that we have to pick and choose what parts of the world we're going to process in terms of information. And for the brain and for our survival is going to be much more valuable to signal when something changes than to be signaled constantly, okay, this object didn't change, it 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 didn't change, now it changed, now it doesn't change, doesn't change, doesn't change. That would be a complete waste of resources. So we only want to signal when things change. And so what that means in a practical sense is that objects that are moving around are going to be much more noticeable to us perceptually, because they're more noticeable to your neurons than objects that don't change. But that is going to be an intrinsic or a hardwired ability, and then through your life experience and exposure to various things can turn into the skill set necessary to play tennis or even to walk around or do any other things. Whenever you learn something and that becomes an automatic behavior that you don't need to think about to perform it, that basically what it means is that that has fundamentally changed the underlying neural connectivity. For me, I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I remember when I was able for the first time to speak directly in English without having to translate first in my head from Spanish to English. And that was a very striking moment for me. At that time when this first happened about 15 years or so ago, I was very confused. At that particular time, I wasn't sure what language I was speaking. I had to stop and think, am I speaking in English? Am I speaking in Spanish? And that was the border between the before and after. But what that basically means in a neural sense is that then my underlying connectivity transformed itself, and now the brain and my language areas, and there are studies that have been performed with monolingual and bilingual people, and there is a transformation in the neural correlates of language production and understanding for people who speak 2 or more languages versus people who speak 1 language, even though they were all born with the same brains.